Hello and welcome to this episode of the Palliative Grief Tending series. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians on whose unceded lands these interviews are recorded, that of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, to acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. In this episode of Grief Tending, I'm joined by Dr. Leigh Donovan. Leigh has over 20 years' experience working in pediatric palliative care and bereavement care in a range of clinical, program, project management, policy and research positions in both the tertiary health and not-for-profit higher education sectors. In 2016, Leigh completed her PhD, exploring the experience and needs of parents whose child has died from cancer. And in 2017, Leigh was awarded a Churchill Fellowship to inform guidelines for bereavement care in children's hospitals across Australia. Leigh is an advocate for public health approaches to palliative care and bereavement care, and throughout her consultancy, Collaborate, she works with individuals, groups and organisations to enhance the place of self and community in the lives of the dying and the bereaved. Leigh is now committed to a path that means wisdom gained through her personal and professional life experiences can be shared with others to tend to the suffering and grief within our community with love, tenderness and compassion. So in this episode, conversation with Leigh, some of the key themes you'll hear us discuss are Leigh's reflections on over 2 decades as a social worker in pediatric palliative care, speaking about how, although there are very useful things obviously in the academic training and qualifications, that there are additional qualities and capacities that are necessary to cultivate in being alongside the rawness of grief, whether in children, adults or in families. We also speak about, while it's necessary to have a toolbox, what's sometimes called strategies for working and supporting with dying people and with bereaved families, that there's equal importance in knowing how and when to draw on those things and the ways in which we cultivate our own inner relationship with grief before we step into supporting other people. Leigh talks about some of the research findings from both her PhD and her Churchill Fellowship relating to the importance of peer support in the bereaved space. And finally, we had a discussion around sustaining long-term practice, and Leigh shared with us with immense openness and vulnerability, reflecting on her own experiences of burnout and offering up some guiding principles for anyone who may be struggling either now or in the future in the work of sustaining themselves as they are a professional caregiver for others. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Leigh, and thank you for joining us for this episode, and I hope that you find it useful. Welcome, Leigh. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Lovely to be with you, Alan.
So, Leigh, as a social worker, with decades of experience in palliative care and someone who's dedicated their career to enhancing bereavement care for bereaved families, could you share with us some of the reflections on your relationship with grief as you look back on your work?
It's interesting because I've been thinking about, trying to prepare for this conversation, Ellen, and it occurs to me that, I've been just an innately caring person since being a very little person, and the people I was most drawn to as a young woman were people like Gandhi and Mother Teresa and people like that. And so it wasn't until I sort of navigated my way into social work in my sort of late 20s and early 30s as a mature student that I really felt like I found home in terms of my vocation, somewhere where caring and empathy, those innate qualities, serve you really well and serve others really well. However, what was interesting was that I began my social work career in pediatric oncology and adult oncology, and then started touching the experience of pediatric palliative care. Naturally, some of the children and families I met, the child would then have the experience of not responding well to treatment and then transition into palliative care and end-of-life care. And what I soon realised was that while my social work degree had equipped me well in some ways, there really hadn't been conversations around loss, grief, and bereavement. And I felt really ill-equipped to be walking alongside families where there was such immense suffering. And I think that was driven from a place of not wanting to do any more harm when there was already so much suffering in front of me. So I think that's, if I think back over time, that's the pinpoint where life changed for me in terms of my vocation, because since then I've been on rather a mission to really understand, what is this thing called grief? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How can I best serve others? Because in social work, everything you're exposed to, everything you touched beyond death and dying is somewhat related to loss. And as a consequence of loss, there is grief. So I went off and did some further study, postgrad study in loss and grief with Judith Murray. At the time, there was a wonderful course running at the University of Queensland, and it was a course that was embedded in what I thought was the rawness of grief. Like, it was theoretical, but not to a point where it sat too distant from the lived experience. It just buoyed me on to think, okay, this is helping me feel a little more comfortable. This is giving me some language and tools to use in a little more of an authentic way. Sadly, that course stopped for some reason, which was quite disappointing. So that was a bit of a sliding doors moment for me. And the other was, just before I stepped into the role of bereavement coordinator with the Pediatric Palliative Care Service, this was sort of some time into my practice by then, because I developed quite a special interest in grief and bereavement. Someone, and I can't remember who, shared this beautiful course that was about to run at Karuna, a Buddhist hospice in Brisbane, called Spiritual Care for the Dying. And for whatever reason, I felt very drawn to that course and did it. And it was there that I realised that for me to be a better practitioner and to really feel more comfortable in the space of grief, I actually needed to confront my own mortality. So that doing that course and being alongside Tenzin Chodron, who ran the course, and kindred spirits in the course, was life-changing for me. It enabled me to really witness my own reservations about death and dying, my own family influences, broader societal influences, a beautiful Buddhist framework around impermanence and loss. So I started feeling a little more comfortable in this space after I did that course. I felt some resonance. I was doing my own work. You got to do your own work before you can help others.
Yeah, that sounds to be like what you're speaking to, and we were talking offline before this around this topic, and it sort of brought to mind that line from I think it's from a Rilke poem, which is, I don't have much knowledge yet in grief, so this massive darkness makes me small, or makes me feel small. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of hear that parallel in your career as you look back on your career, that while you had the kind of academic and book learning, in arriving to your practice, there was something else that wasn't there that you then needed to continue, as you're saying, like doing your own work to expand that. And so I wonder, in addition to things like those courses that you've mentioned, you were sharing some insights around, some of your greatest learnings, I suppose, during your time working with families.
I mean, for me, the richness of learning and feeling more comfortable in this space was absolutely meeting families where they were at, so children and parents, and listening and learning from them. They have been my greatest gift. And it's interesting because when I established the first bereavement service with the Pediatric Palliative Care Service at one of Australia's sort of large tertiary children's hospitals, I was still floundering a bit. How do we best respond to the needs of bereaved families? floundering to the point that, for better or worse, I started a PhD on the topic, are we meeting the needs of bereaved parents in Australia? And interestingly, one of the key findings that came out of that was that the very best care and support comes from family and friends. And this resonates really strongly with Samar Aoun's work, and she's gone on to be quite prolific, having conversations around public health approaches to bereavement care. So I started developing a real interest in how can we move beyond the individual to look more at the societal. And that's been an incredible journey. And listening and learning from mentors around me, such as Julian Abel and Alan Kelleher, who really activate these conversations around let's move our attention away from the 10 to 20% who in some folks in the thanatology world sort of talk about disorders of prolonged grief, which I struggle with a bit. But let's focus our attention on the broader population of grievers. What can we do there, and how can we activate change there? So it's listening to the voices of families through relationships as a social worker. It's listening to the voice of families through my PhD. It's absolutely been listening to the voices of those with a lived experience that has taught me more than anything.
And you were sharing, Leigh, in relation to developing or broadening the skill set that you had when you came to work and you were developing your practice in palliative care, that there was quite a difference between the kind of theory and academic learning, even though that can be applied and has use in practice. There's something different about being in the presence of a family, in the presence of an adult or a child who is in very presently their grief, and that this can often activate quite a lot in the practitioner or the care provider themselves. And I think what you've been speaking about seems to signal that there's some importance of tending to, while we're obviously there in a role as paid caregivers to care for the family or the patient, that there's some importance to tend to what is within the practitioner when you come into that encounter as well.
That's been such a great learning for me, Ellen, because there's a real I think what I learned about myself and watching others as well is that there can be a real risk of feeling like you need to gain more and more and more knowledge. And I was one of those people. I was one of those people that went off and went to conferences and did more study and read every book I could on Thanatology, the study of death and dying. Like, I've got all the language, I know all the theories. But, when you're sitting with someone who is in the experience of immense suffering, a textbook isn't really going to do them a lot of good if you can't be someone that can witness their suffering and sit in the rubble with them. And that's been my greatest learning. And if there was anything I was going to share with those earlier on the path of paying attention to loss and grief and bereavement, it would be to keep in mind that it's the human-to-human connection that is paramount. And certainly I've heard from families whose child has experienced pediatric palliative care, or bereaved families whose child has experienced pediatric palliative care, what they remember most is the tear of one of the doctors sharing really bad news, or that the intimacy of a hug from a healthcare professional who perhaps knew that child for 12 or more years. So it's the human to human connection, and we can get into all sorts of conversations around professional boundaries, et cetera, but in the end, your capacity to sit in the presence and witness suffering and be able to hold it without feeling like you have to move it, fix it, change it, do anything with it. That's been my greatest learning. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing those those reflections. And I suppose as we were talking about this in preparation, it brought to mind one of the most visual ways. I'm someone who really likes a visual metaphor. So one of the most visual ways I've ever heard this described was by a Buddhist teacher and co-founder of the Zen Hospice project over in the States, Frank Ostaseski. So, I just want to read his words and maybe ask if you want to echo anything back from there. He starts by talking about cultivating a don't know mind. It's a kind of a Zen concept around not leading with your pre-prepared or assumed things. So, he says, because I don't have don't know mind, doesn't mean I leave my expertise at home. I do have a toolkit that I've developed over the years, a big yellow toolbox of tools, but I don't lead with my tools when I walk into a patient's room. Because if I set that toolbox down between myself and another person, one of us is sure to trip over it. And he says, so I don't lead with my tools, I lead with my common humanity. And then when I do need a tool, no problem, I can turn around and reach into the toolbox. So it seems to echo what you're saying, this idea that it's not about an either or approach.
I love those words, and they resonate very strongly for me, Ellen. And some of the language I use is soft front, strong back. So we lead with softness, we lead with love and care and compassion. However, knowing that we have a strong back, something to we know we're drawing on either practice wisdom or or some theoretical or great teachers that we've had in our lives that have guided us to where we sit. It's interesting. Certainly when I was working at the Children's Hospital in the bereavement coordinator role, I was often invited to have conversations with staff, potentially nursing staff on a ward if there'd been a death, or when things were coming up that people were finding a little tricky and required some sort of conversation. And what I was always curious about, and I still am in a way, is that folks would say, these are really experienced health professionals. These are sort of staff on the ward that they're right in the thick of it, right next to, they get to know children and families really well, deep bonded relationships. And yet they would often say, well, I don't do bereavement care. And I would say, because my mantra is, the very best bereavement care begins well before the death of a child. So all that relationship that you're building with them, and the trust that they're imbuing you, that is sustained in bereavement. You're the ones in a way that will serve this family better in terms of acknowledging the loss of their child because you had a trusted relationship with them. And the other point I wanted to make around that is that when we look at these more contemporary public health bereavement care approaches, and we think about this pyramid of bereavement care, which, for those viewers that aren't familiar with it, it really acknowledges that at the bottom of the pyramid, there's a universal response to care. So around 70% of us folks in the world, we sit alongside grief in our community, and then you sort of work up the pyramid if there's a more targeted or therapeutic response required. So for most of us, we aren't trained in loss and grief. Our training comes from our own lived experience and simply being human. So, I would like to invite viewers who feel like, well, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counsellor, I'm not a psychologist, I haven't studied in grief, I don't know what to do or say, we'll leave that up to the experts. You are the experts. You folks in the community, when your neighbour dies, when someone in your community is dying, you're the ones that have the most merit in someone's life because you have the trusted relationship. So I think sometimes in the grief world, people like to sort of push the grieving toward professionalised support when really the most comfort and love comes from people they already have a trusted relationship with.
Yeah, and highlighting the importance of tending to relationship as a part of grief tending, I think, is something I really hear in what you're saying, and that I think that might offer some reassurance to people who are feeling that worry, that concern, whether they're health professionals or whether they're neighbors, community members who know someone who is dying or who has died recently, that by all means, therapy and professionalized support have a role to play, but death and dying is everyone's business, and therefore grief is everyone's business, not in a nosy way, but in terms of it's everybody's concern. It's these are things that have been held in community. People have been supported to grieve long before mental health services or psychologists existed. So it sounds like you're speaking to those older ways of people tending difficult experiences of suffering in life through the prism of relationship.
Absolutely, and therein lies the essence of community, relationship.
Mm.
Mm.
Leigh, thinking about that role of community and relationship in grief, you've done a lot of work, both in terms of your Churchill Fellowship was researching peer-to-peer supports in bereavement care, and the work you're involved in now is continuing to develop these approaches in different spaces around the country. So could you speak to, maybe for people who might not be familiar with or have heard these words but maybe don't know what the significance is of peer support programs, peer support, whether or not it's a program, is peer support as an approach?
Of
Yeah.
course. It's interesting because, when I established the first bereavement service and the Pediatric Palliative Care Service, there was no sort of peer relationship or peer program within that. But over time, when I met more and more families, very often I would hear them saying, I just want to speak to another parent. I just want to speak to a parent to know I can survive this, to see that I can survive this. Because right now, in the rubble of my grief, I don't feel like I can survive this. So I became really interested in peer relationships. In my PhD, it came up as well. And it was when I was traveling on my Churchill Fellowship that I met wonderful folk at a big children's hospital in the US who gifted me their peer support program, and they'd been running it for over 10 years. And so they trained folks with a lived experience. So these were parents who had a lived experience of their child being diagnosed with cancer, and right throughout the trajectory for that child, for some to remission and cure, for others to end of life, and then for the family bereavement. And so when I came back to Australia, it really felt the right time. We were creating a new hospital-wide bereavement service at the children's hospital I was working at. And it's interesting looking back, because if I think about the Leigh in 2012 who was developing the bereavement service and the palliative care team versus the Leigh that was co-designing a program with bereaved parents in, I don't know, was it 2020? Sorry, I can't remember the date. It was so very different. And one of the things that came out from the co-design process in 2020, overwhelmingly, was parents saying the number one thing that you need to attend to in this new hospital-wide bereavement service for bereaved families after their child has died is peer-to-peer support. And so that there were just too many messages and too in many varied areas throughout my life to not pay attention to that. So it is certainly a lot of my practice. I've worked with the hospital to begin, develop a framework for a peer-to-peer support program that now is in existence. We're in the hospital-wide service. I've worked with the Children's Hospice in Queensland to develop a companion program, again, where we can bring peers together to find solace within the lived experience. And I'm continuing on a mission to do the same with a new organisation in the community sector. So for me, peer-to-peer relationships, what I've heard from the bereaved is that it's a relationship like no other. It's not professionalised. It's simply embedded in the lived experience. I see you. I know you. I am here and present with you. I can't do that. I'm not a bereaved parent.
Yeah, and that work highlights exactly, as you described, solace. Understanding of that word is around comfort in grief, and there's a unique type of solace that I hear you describing in that peer experience. And so we're certainly grateful for your work and your support in that area, because it facilitates people to connect in that space of common humanity.
Mm.
So one of the things we were, I suppose, touching on earlier today, Leigh, was around the struggle sometimes in healthcare systems, whether as professionals to remain engaged or connected to or trust in our ability to connect through common humanity. And that sometimes, in many people's working life and practice, there can be times where, that leads to exhaustion or gets called burnout, things like that. This is something that I've heard you speak publicly about, and I think it's an important topic that often isn't spoken about. So I wanted to make some space to invite you to reflect on, your own experiences of burnout, which I know were influenced by a range of factors, and share with us, some of the things you've learned from that in relation to grief.
It's something I'm really keen to continue talking about. And the reason I feel comfortable doing that, Ellen, is that I have a privileged position now of being, I guess, someone that's recognised in this space. And I think when you're in such a position, you can talk about experiences like burnout and prove to the world that you can change up life. And like, part of me wants to use the word recover, but I'm not sure if you ever really fully recover from such an experience. I think you're touched in such a way that you're a bit, well, I'm a bit hardwired now in terms of tending to myself first. When when you when you work alongside such immense suffering, there can be a real some of us can feel like we want to fix it. There's a bottomless pit of need and suffering. We are never, ever going to be able to fix this. This isn't a problem to be fixed. It's a experience to be witnessed. And while I certainly wasn't a fixer, I did become an advocate. I was tired of witnessing such suffering, knowing that as a health system, we could do better. We could do a whole lot better. I wasn't suggesting we needed to fix this problem. I was activating to say we need to honour these families once their child dies. We serve them so well while their child is alive and while their child is dying through pediatric palliative care. But we could do a whole lot more in honouring their experience in bereavement. So for many, many years, I was activating and advocating. And Ellen, it's tiring. It felt quite lonely. And I was tired. I was doing a PhD at the time, which in itself is often a recipe for burnout anyway. But when I look back, it was a combination, for me, it was a combination of my sort of day-to-day work life being full of pushing up against, my PhD, which was quite an isolating experience in a way. And then when there's stuff going on at home in your personal life where it's not actually filling up your bucket as well, it doesn't leave much in the bucket. And as a great, I have an external supervisor I see, she talks about the sort of, we work at the 80% emotional level when we work alongside the bereaved. And, I was way over I was over the 100%. And I'm hardwired now to see that. And so, I mean, things that experience has taught me, because I see that experience as a gift now. It taught me what I need to do to keep safe in the world, to keep safe in this mission, because it's one I don't want to shy away from. I guess the other thing I want to say quickly is that I think innately, perhaps some of us, that have a very deep level of empathy are a bit almost more at risk for, we have a real vulnerability. So if anything, maybe we're a bit more at risk for feeling hard. I know I am. But the things that I've sort of taken away from that experience, and in fact, it's interesting because we just talked about peer support. So for me, finding my tribe has been one of the greatest gifts. So, Ellen, we've talked about this. You're one of the tribe. There's a bunch of people in my life now who speak the same language where I can find real resonance. So I don't feel so alone in this advocacy campaign or this conversation. I also had trusted peers at work who I often think when you're in the middle of something big and emotional, others outside you can see it in a way that you can't see it yourself. And you don't want to name it because you can feel like a failure. Why is everyone else managing to do this work and I can't? Why am I so exhausted and everyone else looks okay? It just took one person on the right day for me in my workplace to say, maybe it's time you started thinking about you and looking after yourself, Leigh. And that changed everything. That person knows who she is, but that changed everything. So what do I do now? I embrace my solitude and solitude, because giving out can be taxing all the time. Because I guess I'm someone that gives out both professionally and personally. It's just my nature. So finding ways to sit in solitude for me, it can be being at the beach or in the bush or in nature, somewhere where nature's the greatest gift, where it's quiet and it gives you so much and takes nothing from you. What else? Oh, I think something else, and this is a lesson I'd love to share with others, is this gift of just simply being rather than doing. Um, I at some point I left the tertiary health system and started my own consultancy, Collaborate, because I just knew I needed to work in a different way. This was part of me thinking, how can I continue to do this work in the way that serves me better and potentially serves the world better? So as part of my practice, I offer supervision to palliative care teams and individuals who work in palliative and bereavement care in Australia. And it was earlier this week, I was with a beautiful team and we got onto this conversation around the being rather than the doing. There's a real risk that we can get so caught up in a medicalized world of the doing that we forget simply being is enough. Yeah. I think they're the things, if I was to think back over my time and what I've learned from that experience of burnout or just exhaustion is just, yeah, tend to myself and know thyself well before you can serve others.
Mm. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those insights, with such honesty and vulnerability as well. And I suppose part of our hope in these episodes is that there may be people, watching who are really feeling that twinge or that activation when they listen to this, of knowing that place and feeling probably a range of things that can come again, like you say, when we feel like we can't let people know sometimes that these things are happening. But I guess I just wanted to summarize, because it feels as though, we were talking before, like neither of us like unsolicited advice, but in terms of guiding principles, they can be very helpful, because I think you can explore how they might apply to your own context. So, what I heard in what you were saying was that, yeah, tending to yourself, as a priority. And I even heard first, which can feel, we talk about this in another episode about self-compassion, it can even feel quote unquote selfish to do that. Um, the second was finding a tribe and people who you feel, get who you are, but also have your back and support you. And that seemed to lead into the third one of making sure you've got some solidarity in the workplace with people who will look out for you, and also be brave enough to name, courageous enough to name when they can see maybe what you can't see. And then you mentioned that idea of, of embracing solitude and solitude, really, especially when we're working in spaces where there's a lot of giving. that either taking time to receive, or just to hold with what is. That seemed to flow in that last one of sort of being and doing, tending that sense of being able to be in the being with whatever is present. So thank you so much for those, sharing those principles. We really hope that they're useful either for people listening now, or maybe someone might hear this and go, oh, I might keep that for the future. There might be some difficult times ahead that I might need this. And also, I did want to mention that we'll place links to both the different resources and authors that we've mentioned today, but also to your work and collaborate and your consultancy and supervision practice as well. Again, it's I think more and more being recognised. It's very established in spaces like counselling and therapy and allied health, but less so in some of the medicine specialties. But I think gradually people are. It seems to be expanding, realising that tending to these things is not selfish or weak, or because there's things wrong. It's kind of an integral part of the work.
I've just realised something that I'd love to, like when you talked about teachers and mentors, there's someone who I didn't name, but I should have, because finding their work really helped me acknowledge the being rather than the doing, and that's Alan Wolfelt from the Centre for Loss and Life Transition. He's based in the US, and he's written a beautiful book called Companioning the Bereaved. And in reading that many years ago, I mean, he taught me, he teaches many, about the being, that our role isn't to fix, to move, to nudge. It is simply to witness and love and care. And so I found that's another way of, feeling like you've got the tribe around you, finding, because many years ago when I first entered the Thanatology world, it didn't feel like my tribe. It felt very theoretical, and I was trying so hard to learn all these theories and keep them in my mind, and then I started finding the place that was more comfortable for me, that resonated for me. And in the end, it's all about heart space and the being.
Well, thank you so much, Leigh, for all you've shared with us today, for the lessons from your work, and that encouragement for people wherever they are, wherever they may be working within healthcare, to be with their own being and tend to that as they're giving and serving others.